This happened when I was 17, living with my parents in a small farming town in northern Vermont. We'd been in the same white farmhouse for over a decade, and in all that time, nothing had ever happened that couldn't be explained by an old house being old. The floors creaked whenever the weather changed, the pipes knocked during winter, and the attic made enough noise during windstorms to convince anyone unfamiliar with the place that someone was walking around up there. I never believed in ghosts, and neither did my parents. That's probably why none of us thought twice when they left me home alone for an entire weekend in late October of 2019. My grandmother had broken her hip after falling down her porch steps, and they needed to drive a few hours south to help her once she came home from the hospital. I stayed behind because I had 2 shifts at the grocery store where I worked after school, and my parents trusted me enough to take care of the house. Before leaving, my dad reminded me to lock every door before dark because hunting season had started, and strangers sometimes drove the back roads looking for places to park. My mum filled the refrigerator with leftovers, hugged me goodbye, and they were gone just after 10 that morning. The first day couldn't have been more normal. I ordered pizza, played video games for hours, watched football, and enjoyed having the entire house to myself. My shift ended around 8 that night, and by the time I got home, the temperature had already dropped below freezing. The trees surrounding our property were almost completely bare, and the wind kept pushing dead leaves across the gravel driveway. I remember standing outside for a second after locking my truck because the woods were strangely quiet. Usually there were crickets or at least the sound of wind moving through the branches, but that night there was almost nothing. It wasn't unsettling enough to scare me, just different enough that I noticed it. I locked every door, turned on the porch light, checked that the windows were closed, and settled onto the couch with a movie playing quietly in the background. Around midnight, I finally headed upstairs. As I reached the second floor, I noticed something I hadn't heard all evening: the old grandfather clock downstairs. Normally, I barely paid attention to it, but with nobody else in the house, every tick echoed through the hallway. It almost sounded louder than it should have. I shrugged it off, brushed my teeth, and went to bed. I don't remember dreaming about anything, but I know exactly what time I woke up because the first thing I saw was the alarm clock on my dresser. 2:17 a.m. I laid there, staring at the numbers for a few seconds before I realized why I'd suddenly opened my eyes. Someone was walking down the hallway outside my bedroom. The footsteps were slow, spaced several seconds apart, and heavy enough that I could hear the old floorboards flex under each one. They started near the staircase and came closer until they stopped directly outside my door. Every muscle in my body locked up. My parents weren't supposed to be home until Sunday evening, and there was nobody else who should have been inside that house. I waited for whoever it was to knock or turn the doorknob, but nothing happened. Almost a full minute passed in complete silence before I forced myself out of bed. I grabbed the aluminum baseball bat from my closet, unlocked the bedroom door, and slowly pulled it open. The hallway was empty. Every bedroom door was exactly where I'd left it. The bathroom light was off. The staircase disappeared into darkness. I listened for another sound but heard absolutely nothing except the clock downstairs. I checked every room on the second floor before making my way downstairs with my phone flashlight. The front door was still locked. The deadbolt hadn't moved. Every window was shut from the inside. I even checked the basement because one of the windows down there never sealed properly, but it was untouched. After searching the entire house for nearly 20 minutes, I found nothing that explained the footsteps. I told myself it had probably been the house settling because of the temperature dropping outside. It made enough sense that I eventually convinced myself to go back to bed, even though I left the baseball bat leaning against the wall beside me. The next morning, I laughed about it while making breakfast. By the time I left for work, I'd already decided my imagination had gotten the better of me. Around lunchtime, I called my mum just to check on my grandmother, and I almost mentioned what had happened before deciding not to. She worried about everything, and there was no reason to make her spend the weekend thinking someone had been inside the house when I didn't actually believe that myself. My shift ended just before sunset. On the drive home, a light snow had started falling, covering the road and the fields surrounding our property. When I pulled into the driveway, something immediately caught my attention. The porch light was off. I knew I'd left it on because I always did whenever I came home after dark. At first, I figured the bulb had burned out, but when I unlocked the front door, every light inside the house was exactly as I'd left it except for the porch switch, which was flipped down. I stared at it for a few seconds, trying to remember if I'd accidentally turned it off before leaving that morning, but I couldn't honestly say. It was such a small thing that I eventually ignored it. I made dinner, watched another movie, and texted a couple of friends until almost midnight. Before heading upstairs, I checked every lock again, turned the porch light back on, and looked through the front window toward the driveway. Snow was still falling, and everything outside reflected just enough light that I could clearly see the yard. Nobody was there. I slept for what felt like only an hour before my eyes snapped open again. Without even looking at the clock, I somehow knew what time it was. I turned my head toward the dresser. 2:17 a.m. This time there weren't footsteps. Someone was humming. It was soft, almost too quiet to make out, but it was definitely a woman's voice. She wasn't singing words, just one slow melody that seemed to drift up from somewhere downstairs. At first, I thought maybe I'd left the television on, but after listening for a few seconds, I realized the sound wasn't staying in one place. It was moving, slowly, like someone humming to themselves while walking through the first floor of the house. Then it stopped. Not gradually, instantly. The silence that followed somehow felt even worse. I sat perfectly still, listening so hard my ears actually started hurting. About 30 seconds later, I heard one floorboard creak directly outside my bedroom. Then another. Then the unmistakable sound of someone taking a slow breath on the other side of the door. I didn't move. Whatever had made that sound was standing close enough to my bedroom door that I could hear the old wood settling beneath its weight. I stared at the doorknob, waiting for it to turn, but it never did. Instead, the humming started again. Only this time it was quieter, almost as if whoever was outside had begun walking away from my room. I counted every step until the sound disappeared toward the staircase. A few seconds later, the first floor creaked beneath what sounded like another slow step. Then everything went silent. I stayed frozen for nearly 10 minutes before convincing myself I had to check the house. My phone showed 1 bar of service, just like the night before. I opened the camera app and turned on the flashlight instead of using the regular light because I didn't want to announce where I was if someone had somehow gotten inside. The hallway was empty. Every bedroom door was exactly where I'd left it. I walked downstairs one step at a time, listening more than looking. The living room looked untouched. The television was off. The kitchen lights were off. The only thing I noticed immediately was that one of the dining room chairs had been pulled away from the table by about 2 feet. I stopped walking. I knew for a fact every chair had been pushed in because I always did it before going upstairs. I stood there trying to convince myself I'd forgotten, but the longer I looked at it, the less I believed that explanation. I slowly pushed the chair back into place and looked around the room. That's when I noticed something else. The back door wasn't fully closed. It was only open by an inch, but enough for freezing air to drift into the kitchen. My stomach dropped. I clearly remembered locking it before bed. I walked over, expecting to see signs that someone had forced it open, but the lock was still intact. The deadbolt was still extended. Somehow the door simply hadn't latched all the way. I pulled it shut until I heard the click, locked it again, and looked outside through the glass. Snow covered almost everything. My truck, the driveway, the backyard. What caught my attention wasn't outside the door. It was the footprints. There weren't any. If someone had opened that door from outside, there should have been tracks leading to it. The snow was untouched. I remember staring at the ground for almost a minute because my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. I backed away from the door, checked every room one last time, then locked myself inside my bedroom until sunrise. I barely slept. Sunday morning, I walked outside hoping daylight would make everything seem less strange. The snow around the house was completely undisturbed except for my own footprints from leaving for work the previous evening. There wasn't a single set of tracks leading toward the woods, the driveway, or either entrance to the house. I spent the rest of the day trying not to think about it. Around 5 that afternoon, my parents finally came home. I almost told them everything, but halfway through explaining the footsteps, I could already hear how unbelievable it sounded. My dad smiled and said old houses could play tricks on people when they were alone. My mum asked if I was getting enough sleep. After that, I let it go. Life returned to normal. Weeks passed without another incident. Then one evening, my mum casually asked if I'd been walking around upstairs a few nights earlier. I told her no. She frowned and said she'd woken up around 2 in the morning because she'd heard someone slowly pacing the hallway outside their bedroom. She assumed it was me getting a drink, but when she checked my room, I was asleep. My dad laughed and blamed the heating pipes again, but I noticed my mum never looked convinced. About a month later, our elderly neighbour, Mr. Collins, stopped by to return a ladder he'd borrowed. While we were talking near the driveway, he looked toward the house and asked how we were settling in after all these years. I joked that the only problem was the strange noises the place made at night. His expression changed immediately. He asked me what kind of noises. I mentioned footsteps. I didn't tell him anything else. He stayed quiet for several seconds before saying, "So you've heard her too?" I honestly thought he was messing with me until I saw he wasn't smiling. He explained that long before my family bought the farmhouse, an elderly widow had lived there alone after her husband died. According to him, she spent years sleeping in the upstairs bedroom at the end of the hallway because she refused to leave the home they'd built together. She passed away peacefully in the house one winter, and although nobody ever claimed anything dangerous happened afterward, people occasionally mentioned hearing slow footsteps in the hallway late at night or someone quietly humming downstairs. He shrugged after telling me, almost embarrassed, and admitted he'd always assumed those stories were just small-town gossip until another family mentioned hearing the exact same thing years later. I never told him about the chair, the back door, or waking up at exactly 2:17 both nights. I didn't want to hear anything else. We moved out of that farmhouse 2 years later after my parents decided the commute into town was becoming too much. I helped pack almost everything during the final week. On the last evening, while carrying boxes through the hallway, I noticed something hanging on the wall outside my old bedroom. It was the same grandfather clock I'd listened to every night growing up. My dad laughed when he took it down because it had stopped working months earlier. He opened the back panel to remove the batteries before packing it away. Both batteries had completely corroded inside the compartment. They were so badly damaged, they looked like they'd been dead for years. He even joked that he couldn't believe the clock had still been ticking for so long. I didn't say anything because I remembered lying awake both nights, listening to that steady ticking echo through the silent house just before I looked at my alarm clock and saw 2:17 a.m. I still think about that weekend every October. Maybe there is a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything that happened. Maybe I forgot to latch the back door. Maybe I pushed the dining room chair out myself without realizing it. Maybe exhaustion made ordinary sounds feel frightening. But I've never found an explanation for hearing a clock that shouldn't have been running, or why every strange thing that happened inside that house seemed to begin at exactly the same minute. Even now, whenever I wake up in the middle of the night and my phone says 2:17, I stay in bed for a few extra minutes before opening my bedroom door.